What would you do if all you had left was a single dollar and the memory of smoke? For Sadie Polk, homeless at 19 in the muddy streets of Providence, Missouri, that question wasn't a flight of fancy. It was the hard truth of an autumn morning in 1884. The boarding house where she'd worked for her keep was a pile of wet, black bones, and everything she owned had turned to ash on the wind. But the forgotten wreck she bought with that last silver dollar held a secret that could either rebuild a town or drown it for good. The river had taken much in its time, but it was about to give something back. Settle in and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell a story of what happens when the deepest wreck holds the highest hope. Sadie Polk stood before the town clerk's office, the dollar coin feeling thin and cold in her palm. Her coat, a threadbare thing she'd grabbed from a fleeing boarder, smelled of soot and fear. Her face, usually pale, was smudged with gray, and her long braid was heavy with the damp morning air. She had walked the length of Providence since dawn, from the blackened ruin of her old life to the indifferent storefronts lining the main street. Every door was closed to her. There was no work for a girl with no people, no roof, and no possessions but the clothes on her back. She was a ghost in her own town, visible only as a problem to be avoided. She had heard the whispers, the clicks of tongues. That's Polk's girl. Just like her father, ending up with nothing. The memory of her father was a dull ache, a man who had chased dreams up and down the Missouri River until one day he simply didn't come back, leaving behind nothing but debts and a reputation for folly. Her gaze drifted past the clerk's window toward the riverbank, where the skeletal remains of a paddle steamer lay half swallowed by mud and time. The wandering star. Even as a child, it had been there, a monument to failure. The story was that its captain, a man named Elias Vance, had vanished 20 years prior, taking the boat's payroll and leaving it to rot. It was a town joke, a landmark of bad luck. But for Sadie, looking at its broken spine and listing deck, it wasn't a joke. It was a shape. It was a roof of a sort. It was something to own when she owned nothing else. She pushed open the door to the clerk's office, the bell above it giving a weary jingle. Mr. Abernathy, a man whose face was a roadmap of disappointment, looked up over his spectacles. Sadie. Heard about the fire? A terrible thing. His voice was dry, official. Nothing I can do for you. Town council has no funds for charity cases. Sadie didn't flinch. She had not come for charity. She placed her single dollar on the worn wooden counter. I want to buy the Wandering Star, she said, her voice quiet but clear. Abernathy blinked, then let out a short, dry laugh. The wreck? Child, that's not property. That's a hazard. It's on the town rolls, Sadie stated, her gaze unwavering. For back taxes. $1. She knew this because her father had once considered buying it himself, another of his grand, failed schemes. The clerk stared at her, a flicker of something, pity perhaps, or just bewilderment in his eyes. He sighed, a long, rattling sound. He pulled a dusty ledger from a shelf, blew a cloud of grime from its cover, and flipped through the brittle pages. He found the entry, a faded line of ink. He dipped his pen, scratched out a name, and wrote hers in. He took her dollar. Sold, he said, with the finality of a man washing his hands of a fool. The folly is yours. He pushed a brittle deed of sale across the counter. As she took it, her fingers brushed against his expression softened for just a moment. Be careful down there, Sadie. The river keeps what it takes. The warning hung in the air, heavier than the smell of old paper and dust, As she walked back out into the indifferent light of day, the deed to a ruin clutched in her hand. The paper felt impossibly fragile, a whisper of ownership for a ghost of a boat. Walking back down the main street, Sadie felt the weight of eyes upon her. The news had already spread, carried on the wind like gossip or disease. She saw the women sweeping their porches stop and stare, their mouths forming tight, disapproving lines. Men leaving the general store paused, nudged each other, and smirked. The purchase was not just an act of desperation. In their eyes, it was an admission of defeat, a final embrace of the Polk family legacy of failure. She clutched the deed tighter, its sharp edges digging into her palm. This wasn't a surrender. It was the only move she had left to make. The boat was a place to be. A place that could not burn down because it was already ruined, already given over to the water. It was a place where no one could evict her, for who would want it? It was a kind of freedom bought for $1. She thought of her father, a man who saw potential where others saw only rust and rot. He would have understood. Or perhaps he too would have thought her a fool. The line between vision and folly was one she was now walking herself. As she neared the edge of town, a carriage rattled to a stop beside her. Mayor Gable, a man whose prosperity had grown in direct proportion to the town's quiet hardships, leaned out. He was thick-set, with a face that seemed permanently flushed with self-satisfaction. He held a smoking cigarillo in a gloved hand. "Well, I'll be," he boomed, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "Sadie Polk, I hear congratulations are in order. The new captain of the Wandering Star." His laughter was loud and wet, an ugly sound that made Sadie's jaw tighten. "That boat was a bad investment when it was floating, girl. Now it's just mud ballast. You've wasted your last $1. Sadie met his gaze and said nothing. Her silence was a wall he could not breach, and it only seemed to amuse him more. "Just like your father," he added, his smile turning cruel, "always reaching for things that were already sunk." He flicked his cigarillo into the mud at her feet, a gesture of casual contempt, and ordered his driver to move on, leaving Sadie standing in the wake of his dust and derision. Her face burned, but her resolve hardened into something cold and solid. Let them laugh. Their laughter couldn't make her any colder or more hungry than she already was. What secret could possibly be worth salvaging from a tomb of mud and splintered wood? Was this an act of desperation, or the first step toward a future no one could see? Let us know what you think in the comments, and be sure to subscribe for more stories like this. For Sadie, the answer was waiting behind a single, swollen door. The whispers followed her all the way to the riverbank. They were a current in the air, a rustle of judgment in the dry autumn leaves. Polk's girl, buying Polk's folly. Some things run in the family. She ignored them. Her focus narrowed to the path ahead, a muddy track that wound down through skeletal cottonwoods to the water's edge. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows that made the familiar landscape seem strange and unwelcoming. As she rounded a bend, she saw an old woman sitting on a fallen log, mending a fishing net with gnarled, patient fingers. It was Elspeth, a woman who lived in a shack downriver and was regarded by the townsfolk as half-wild, a creature of the river itself. She was ancient, her face a web of deep lines, her eyes the color of the murky water, holding a depth that seemed to see through skin and bone. Elspeth didn't look up as Sadie approached, but she spoke, her voice raspy like stones grinding together. "They're laughing at you up there," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know," Sadie replied, her own voice barely aware with a deft twist of her fingers. Laughter is the sound of fools who can't hear the river talking. She finally lifted her gaze, and her eyes fixed on Sadie with an unnerving intensity. You bought the star. Again, not a question. Sadie simply nodded, the deed still in her hand. Elspeth looked from Sadie's face to the wreck sitting silent in the shallows. That boat ain't empty, she murmured, a strange gravity in her tone. Some captains don't abandon their ship. They just wait for a new pilot. The old woman's words were cryptic, settling into Sadie's mind like silt, cloudy and unsettling. She didn't know what to make of them, but they felt less like a warning and more like a pronouncement. She left Elspeth to her nets and continued down the path, the mayor's scornful laughter echoing in her memory, clashing with the river woman's strange prophecy. The two voices represented the town's judgment, the loud public mockery and the quiet private mystery. One dismissed her as a fool, the other hinted at a purpose she couldn't yet comprehend. She pushed them both aside. What mattered now was shelter. What mattered was surviving the night. The town had written her off. Mayor Gable had publicly humiliated her. Even the well-meaning pity of the clerk felt like a kind of dismissal. She was alone, armed with a worthless deed and a cryptic blessing from a woman most people avoided. She had been cast out, and her only refuge was the very thing that symbolized her family's, and now her own, perceived failure. But as she stood on the muddy bank, looking at the dark, hulking shape of the riverboat, a strange sense of belonging settled over her. This was hers, this wreck, this folly, this tomb of splintered wood and rust. It had waited for her, and she would not abandon it. The journey to the boat was a slog through thick, greedy mud that sucked at her worn boots with every step. The air grew cooler near the water, carrying the damp, earthy smell of decay and wet leaves. Reeds, tall and brittle, whispered around her as she pushed through them. The wandering star loomed larger as she approached. Not a boat so much as a fallen giant. It was canted hard to port, its starboard paddle wheel shattered, its once white paint peeled away to reveal the gray, waterlogged wood beneath. The main deck was a treacherous landscape of broken planks, slick with moss and algae. It looked even more hopeless up close. A profound sense of disappointment washed over Sadie, cold and sharp. The faint hope that had carried her here began to wither. Mayor Gable was right. This was nothing but mud ballast. This was a grave. Still, she had nowhere else to go. She found a section of the upper deck that was relatively level and swept clear of the worst of the debris. As the last light of day bled from the sky, turning the river to a sheet of hammered copper, she sat down, pulling her thin coat tight around her shoulders. The silence was immense, broken only by the gentle lap of water against the hull and the groan of the boat settling deeper into the mud. It was a lonely, mournful sound, the sigh of something that had been dying for a very long time. She didn't sleep much that first night. The wood beneath her was cold, and the boat shifted with the river's current, a slow, rhythmic rocking that felt less like a cradle and more like the breathing of a dying animal. From the shore, a pair of yellow eyes watched her. A stray dog, its ribs showing like a washboard beneath its matted fur, stood silently at the edge of the reeds, too wary to come closer but seemingly unwilling to leave. It was as much an outcast as she was. As dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft rose, Sadie rose, stiff and chilled to the bone. The dog was still there, a patient, lonely sentinel. She felt a kinship with the creature. They were two survivors on the edge of the world, drawn to the same forgotten place. She decided to explore her new, dilapidated kingdom. The main cabins were ruined, their doors hanging open, their interiors filled with mud and debris from years of floods. It all seemed to confirm her initial despair. This was a place of endings, not beginnings. But as she made her way toward the stern, she saw the captain's quarters. It was set higher than the other cabins, and while the rest of the boat listed and sagged, this section seemed strangely solid, its lines straighter, its construction more robust. The door was closed fast, the wood dark and swollen tight in its frame. It looked impassable. A feeling of finality, of a journey ending at a locked door, began to settle in her heart. The sun was higher now, its pale light glinting off something on the door. Sadie moved closer, her boots squelching in the thin layer of mud on the deck. It wasn't the wood of the door itself that held her attention, but the hardware. While the ironwork on the rest of the vessel was pitted with rust, eaten away by 2 decades of exposure, the hinges on this door were thick and black, barely touched by corrosion. The lock was a heavy brass plate tarnished to a deep green brown, but it was intact, solid, its keyhole a dark, forbidding slot. This was not the work of a simple riverboat carpenter. This was the work of a man building a vault, not a cabin. The door was not just closed, it was sealed. It was a statement of intent. The rest of the boat had been left to the mercy of the river, but this one place had been fortified against it. The contrast was stark, a single point of order in a world of chaos. Why would a captain lavish such expense and care on one door, on one small room, while the rest of his vessel was built to more ordinary standards? It didn't make sense. It was a detail that refused to fit. The stray dog, which had finally padded its way onto the boat, came to stand beside her. It didn't bark, but let out a low, soft whine. Its nose pointed directly at the base of the sealed door. It seemed to sense it too, that this was not just another ruined room. This was the heart of the wreck, and it was still beating. Sadie ran her fingers over the cold brass of the lock plate. Beneath the grime, she felt a small, almost invisible marking. She scraped at it with her fingernail, revealing a single, elegantly carved initial, an E. Not for Vance, the captain whose name was on all the official records, Elias. It was his initial. But it was the style of it, a looping, almost feminine script that felt out of place. It was a personal mark, not a maker's mark. It was a sign of pride, of possession. This room was more than just the captain's quarters. It was his sanctuary, his safe. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, a distant lesson from his workshop. Always look at the joints, Sadie. The way a man joins 2 pieces of wood tells you everything. It tells you what he wants to protect and what he's willing to let go. This door was a joint between the world and whatever Captain Vance had wanted to protect. The challenge of it sparked something in her, a flicker of purpose in the cold ashes of her despair. She had a key of a sort, her father's knowledge, and she had a tool, her own stubborn refusal to be defeated. The town saw a wreck. Mayor Gable saw a joke. But standing before this defiant door, with a silent, watchful dog at her side, Sadie Polk began to see a question that demanded an answer. What was inside that was worth protecting so fiercely? What secret had Captain Elias Vance bolted shut before he disappeared into the river's gray mist forever? The next days fell into a rhythm of labor, a steady beat of effort against resistance. Sadie's world shrank to the few square feet of decking in front of the captain's door. Her first task was to find a lever. She waded into the murky water beside the hull, and wrestled a long, solid-looking piece of oak from the shattered paddle wheel. It was heavy, but it was strong. This would be her crowbar. Her silent companion, the stray dog she had started calling Drift, never left her side. He would lie in a patch of sun, his head on his paws, watching her with intelligent, patient eyes. When she paused, exhausted, he would rise, stretch, and nudge her hand with his cold nose, a quiet encouragement to continue. He was a constant, living presence in the profound silence of the wreck. She began her assault on the door. It was not a matter of force. The wood was too thick, the iron too strong. It was a puzzle of leverage and weakness. She remembered her father showing her how to unseat a stubborn nail, not by pulling it straight out, but by working it back and forth, loosening the wood's grip grain by grain. She applied the same logic to the hinges. She wedged the tip of her oak lever into the tiny gap between the hinge plate and the doorframe and began to work, putting her entire weight into it. The boat groaned in protest, but the hinge didn't budge. Her hands, soft from her work in the boarding house kitchen, were soon raw and blistered. The blisters broke, and her palms bled. She tore strips from the hem of her petticoat to wrap them, the clean white fabric quickly turning brown with grime and rust. Every muscle in her back and shoulders screamed. At night, she would collapse onto her patch of deck, sharing the stale crust of bread she'd found in a discarded sack with Drift. The dog would eat his small portion delicately, then curl up near her feet, a warm, breathing anchor in the cold darkness. During those long hours of work, her mind would drift back to her father. She remembered the smell of his workshop, sawdust and turpentine and sweat. She remembered the feel of his calloused hand guiding hers as he taught her to use a plane, to read the grain of a piece of wood. "Don't fight the wood, Sadie," he'd say. "Understand it. Every piece has a story, a direction it wants to go. You just have to listen." He had been a dreamer, a man full of plans that never quite solidified, but he had known things. He had understood the secret language of wood and iron. That knowledge, his only true inheritance to her, was what she now clung to. It was a connection to him, a way to make his failed dreams mean something. She was not just prying open a door. She was trying to prove that the Polk legacy was not just one of folly. After 3 days of relentless effort, something shifted. A groan, not from the boat, but from the metal of the top hinge. A sliver of rust flaked away, and the massive iron pin inside moved a fraction of an inch. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Hope, sharp and bright, surged through her. She focused all her energy on that one spot, working the lever back and forth, ignoring the fire in her muscles. The pin began to slide, slowly at first, then with more ease, until with a final screeching complaint, it came free. The top of the door sagged inward, its weight now hanging entirely on the lower hinge and the lock. She had found the weak point. She had listened. The bottom hinge gave way more easily, and soon the door was held only by the tarnished brass lock. She stood back, breathing heavily, sweat and grime streaking her face. The door was canted, broken, but still locked. Through the gap at the top, she could smell the air from inside, stale, dry, with the faint, papery scent of time itself. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting, undisturbed, for a very long time. Drift rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest, his eyes fixed on the dark opening she had created. The secret of the wandering star was close now. She could feel it. Just on the other side of the wood and brass, The lock was the final guardian. Without a key, it seemed an impossible barrier. Sadie spent a full day examining it, probing the keyhole with a piece of wire, trying to understand its mechanism. It was no use. It was a high-quality tumbler lock, far beyond her ability to pick. Defeated, she slumped against the opposite wall of the passageway, the silence of the boat pressing in on her. Drift came and rested his head on her lap. As she stroked his matted fur, her eyes fell upon the captain's logbook, which she'd found earlier, half submerged in a waterlogged crate. Most of it was a pulpy, illegible mess, but she had saved it on the faint hope it might contain something of value. Now she picked it up again, idly flipping through the stiff, mildewed pages. The ink had bled into abstract blooms of black and blue. But the last few pages, at the very back of the book, had been protected by a thick leather flap. They were damp, but the writing was still clear. The final entries were dated from the spring of 1864. They were mostly notations of cargo and river conditions, but the very last entry was different. It wasn't about the boat. It was a short, cryptic sentence. The key is in the heart of the promise. The heart of the promise. The words meant nothing to her. She read them again and again, trying to decipher their meaning. What promise? Whose promise? She looked back at the door, at the elegant carved E beside the lock. Elias. And then she noticed something else. The logbook's cover was made of thick, pressed leather. In the center was an embossed emblem, a stylized star. But it felt thicker there, stiffer than the rest of the cover. A strange intuition, a spark of insight, made her take her knife, a small, dull blade she used for cutting bread, and carefully slit the stitching around the emblem. She peeled back the top layer of leather. Tucked inside, flat against the bookboard, was a small, intricately shaped iron key. It was cold to the touch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled back to the door, her hands trembling so much she could barely fit the key into the lock. It slid in perfectly. With a deep, satisfying click, the tumblers aligned and the bolt withdrew. The door swung inward with a low groan, opening into darkness. She held her lantern high and stepped across the threshold. The air inside was still and heavy, like the air of a tomb. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, but nothing was disturbed. A narrow bunk, a small desk, a chair, all bolted to the floor, and there, beneath the bunk, was a heavy iron chest, its surface pitted with age, also bolted fast to the thick oak planks of the floor. It wasn't just a sea chest. It was a safe. A profound sense of awe washed over her. She had found it. She had opened the door to the boat's secret heart. Now she just had to open the chest itself. The key to the door did not fit the chest's formidable lock. But as she ran her hands over its cold iron surface, she found another inscription, almost invisible in the dim light. It was a name, Eleonora, and beneath it, a date. The same date as the last entry in the logbook. The storm came without warning. One moment the sky was a placid gray canvas. The next, it was a churning mass of bruised clouds, and the wind began to howl like a hungry wolf. Rain came down not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that lashed the river's surface into a frenzy. The wandering star, which had rested quietly for 20 years, began to move. It groaned and shuddered as the rising water lifted it from the mud's embrace, its old timbers screaming in protest. Sadie, still inside the captain's quarters, felt the deck heave beneath her feet. The lantern flickered wildly, casting dancing, monstrous shadows on the walls. Her first thought was for the chest. She had to protect it. She tried to move it, but it was bolted fast, an anchor holding the room's secrets to the boat's very soul. The river was rising with terrifying speed, brown water swirling over the main deck, carrying debris that hammered against the hull like a battering ram. The boat was being torn apart. Through the roar of the wind and rain, she heard another sound, a human cry, thin and desperate. She rushed out of the cabin and saw it, a small farm wagon caught in the flash flood that was turning the riverbank into a torrent, had overturned. A man and a woman were clinging to the wagon's wheel, while two small children were being swept away by the current. Without a second thought, Sadie grabbed a coil of old, thick rope from the deck. She tied one end to a cleat, the other around her waist, and plunged into the churning, icy water. The current was a physical force, trying to drag her under, but she fought it, her eyes fixed on the small, struggling forms of the children. She reached the boy first, grabbing the back of his shirt and hauling him toward the boat. She got him onto the relative safety of the listing deck and went back for his sister. The parents, seeing what she was doing, fought their way toward the boat as well. By the time she had pulled the little girl from the water, Sadie was exhausted, her limbs numb with cold, her lungs burning. The family, the Millers, huddled together on the deck, soaked and terrified, but alive. "Thank you," the man said, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us." Sadie could only nod, her teeth chattering too hard to speak. The storm raged around them, a symphony of destruction. The boat pitched and rolled, threatening to break apart at any moment. Sadie herded the family into the most sheltered part of the upper deck, a small, stable-like structure that had once housed livestock. She gave them her own thin blanket and worked to secure loose planks that were being torn away by the wind. She was no longer just protecting a secret. She was protecting lives. Her own quest for fortune felt small and selfish in the face of the storm's fury and the family's terror. She had brought them aboard her ruin, her folly, and now their survival depended on it holding together. Throughout the long, terrifying night, she stood watch, the wind tearing at her, the rain soaking her to the bone. She was a captain now, not of a proud steamer, but of a broken refuge, her crew a family of strangers. She had made her choice. She had used her sanctuary to shelter others, committing herself fully to the fate of the wandering star and all who were aboard it. When dawn finally broke, the world was quiet, washed clean and utterly transformed. The storm had passed. The river was still high and brown, but it was no longer a raging monster. The Miller family was safe, huddled together but unharmed. The wandering star had held. It had lost more of its decking, and the port side was lower in the water than ever. But its heart, the captain's quarters, was still intact. As the first rays of sunlight touched the deck, Mr. Miller approached Sadie. His face was etched with exhaustion and gratitude. "We owe you our lives, miss," he said, his voice thick. "We lost everything. Our wagon, our supplies, everything." Sadie looked past him, to the iron chest still bolted to the floor in the cabin. She had something. She didn't yet know what it was worth, but it was something. "Let's see what we can salvage," she said. She returned to the cabin, Mr. Miller following her. The chest was still locked. The name, Eleonora, and the date were the only clues. "Eleonora," she murmured. It felt important. She went back to the logbook, to the last entry. The key is in the heart of the promise. What if the promise was a person? What if the key was a date? She traced the numbers of the date with her finger. April 16th, 64. A combination. She returned to the chest and saw that the lock was not a keyhole, but a complex dial mechanism she hadn't noticed in the dark. She carefully turned the dials. 4, 16, 64. A heavy clunk echoed in the small cabin. The lock had opened. With trembling hands, she lifted the heavy iron lid. Inside, everything was perfectly dry, wrapped in oilcloth. On top lay a stack of official-looking shipping contracts. Beneath them was a thick packet of documents tied with a faded red ribbon. She untied it and fanned them out. They were land deeds. Mr. Miller, looking over her shoulder, let out a sharp gasp. He pointed a trembling finger at one of the deeds. "That's my name," he whispered. "That's my father's name. That's our farm." He explained that his family, along with several others, had lost their land to Mayor Gable years ago. The mayor had bought up their debt during a bad harvest, claiming their original titles, which were supposed to arrive by river, had been lost. But here they were, delivered to this boat, but never delivered to the families. Beneath the deeds was a heavy leather wallet. Sadie opened it. It was filled not with cash, but with bearer bonds from the St. Louis Union Bank, their paper still crisp. It was the payroll, the money Captain Vance had been accused of stealing. He hadn't stolen it. He had locked it away for safekeeping before he disappeared. News of the Miller family's rescue and the discovery on the boat traveled with the speed of a telegraph wire. Mr. Miller, holding his family's rightful deed, became Sadie's staunchest ally. He insisted on escorting her to the county seat, to a lawyer he trusted. The town of Providence watched as Sadie Polk, the girl who had bought a wreck, rode out of town with a rescued family and a locked box. Their expressions no longer filled with mockery, but with a dawning, confused respect. The tide, it seemed, was beginning to turn. The lawyer in Clarksville, a man named Silas Croft, was old and sharp, with eyes that missed nothing. He listened to Sadie's story without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. He examined the deed to the Wandering Star, the land titles, and finally, the bearer bonds. He held one of the bonds up to the light, studying the watermark, the signature, the engraving. A low whistle escaped his lips. "These are genuine," he said, his voice holding a note of awe. "And because they are bearer bonds, ownership lies with whoever holds them. They are as good as gold." He did a quick calculation on a piece of scratch paper. The total value was staggering. It was a fortune that could build a town from the ground up. "And these deeds," he continued, tapping the stack of papers, "they are legally binding. They were registered. They just never reached their owners. Captain Vance was transporting them as a registered agent." The picture became clear. Captain Vance had not been a thief. He had been a custodian. When his boat went down or got stuck, he had secured the most valuable cargo, the deeds and the bonds, in his custom-built safe, intending to retrieve them. But he had vanished, and his secret had remained locked away for 20 years. Mr. Miller's story and the identical stories of a half-dozen other families painted the rest of the picture. Mayor Gable had known those deeds were coming. He had likely been tracking the boat. When the Wandering Star failed to arrive, he had used the opportunity, buying up the family's debts and seizing their land under the guise of lost paperwork, knowing full well their proof of ownership was sitting in a wreck at the bottom of the river. The return to Providence was different. There were no whispers, no smirks. The townspeople watched Sadie and Mr. Miller ride back in, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The truth, carried ahead of them by rumor, had unsettled the town's foundations. Mayor Gable met them in the street, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a pallor of fear. "This is nonsense," he stammered as Mr. Croft, who had accompanied them, presented the deeds. "These are forgeries. They have been verified by the county recorder," Croft said calmly. "The same office where you filed your foreclosures, Mayor. The dates will be quite illuminating." Gable's face crumbled. He was not a monster, just a greedy, opportunistic man who had been caught. He was humbled not by force, but by the quiet, undeniable weight of the truth. He didn't fight. He knew he was beaten. Within a week, the deeds were restored to their rightful owners. A quiet revolution took place in Providence, not of anger, but of restoration. Families who had been tenants on their own land for a generation were suddenly owners again. The chorus of townspeople, who had once laughed at the girl buying a wreck, now looked at her with a kind of reverence. She hadn't just found money, she had unearthed a buried history. She had returned to them something they thought was lost forever: justice. Sadie Polk, the girl with nothing, had given them back their homes, and in doing so, she had finally found her own. The late autumn sun cast a long golden light across the water, turning the muddy Missouri into a river of liquid honey. Sadie stood on the deck of the Wandering Star, a hammer in her hand. The boat was still a wreck, but it was no longer a symbol of failure. It was her home. With a portion of the money from the bonds, she had hired a crew of men, Mr. Miller and his neighbors among them, to help her raise and repair the vessel. They weren't restoring it to a working paddle steamer, but to something new. The lower decks were being converted into a warehouse for the farmers to store their goods, a cooperative venture that would give them leverage against traders from the city. The upper decks were being rebuilt into a small, clean boarding house. Drift, no longer gaunt but sleek and content, lay sleeping at her feet, his tail thumping softly against the freshly laid planks. The laughter and scorn of the town were a distant memory, replaced by the sounds of saws and hammers, the sounds of building. The people of Providence no longer called her Polk's girl. They called her Miss Polk, and they said it with respect. She had not kept the fortune for herself. She had invested it in the town, in the people who, like her, had been dismissed and written off. She had established a fund to guarantee fair prices for their crops and had paid off the town's debts. She had healed the wounds that Mayor Gable's greed had inflicted. Mr. Miller walked up the gangplank, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked around at the bustling activity, at the new life being breathed into the old wreck. "It's amazing what you've done, Miss Polk," he said, his voice full of sincere admiration. "What are you building here, anyway?" Sadie looked from the boat to the newly plowed fields on the shore, where families were working their own land with a hope they hadn't had in years. She looked at the quiet town, now stirring with a new sense of purpose. She thought of the cold, lonely girl who had arrived here with nothing but $1 and a memory of ash. She was no longer that girl. The river had given her more than a fortune. It had given her a purpose. "A harbor," she said quietly. "Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet courage. It reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasure isn't what you find, but what you restore." If you were moved by Sadie's journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales from the frontier. We'll see you next time.